I need to tell you something that might make you angry. For years, you have been throwing money at the tackle industry. $60 kits, synthetic dips, holographic lures that look like they belong in a science fiction movie. And the fish do not care. They never cared. The entire system is designed to catch your wallet, not the fish. How do I know? Because at a regional tournament at Bull Shoals Lake in northern Arkansas, over 100 anglers showed up loaded with the most expensive gear money can buy. 2 days later, the guy standing on top of the podium was a retired 62-year-old from Montana, carrying a fiberglass rod and a small container pulled from his shirt pocket. 54 fish. The runner-up had 31. The referees checked for illegal pre-chumming. Found nothing. That container held a $3 secret that the commercial bait industry has been burying for decades. Today, you are going to learn exactly what was in it, the university-backed science behind why it works, and how to use it on your very next trip. And once you see the truth, there is no going back. 1. The Great Bait Deception and the 60% Rule. Imagine being blindfolded in a dark kitchen. You cannot see a single thing. But the second someone starts frying bacon 3 rooms away, you know exactly what is happening. Now multiply that ability by 1,000. That is what every fish in every lake and river in America is doing, every second of every day. They are not looking for food. They are smelling for it. 60% of a fish's brain, over half of the entire organ, is dedicated to processing scent. In a human, that number is less than 2%. A fish is, from an evolutionary standpoint, a biological smell-detecting machine walking around in a suit of scales. Species like the channel catfish are so densely packed with chemical receptors that marine biologists have a nickname for them: swimming tongues. Their entire bodies can taste the water around them. Researchers at Duke University documented that certain freshwater species can detect amino acids at a concentration equivalent to 1 single drop of blood dissolved into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. 1 drop in an entire pool. That is the level of sensitivity you are dealing with. So when you cast a synthetic plastic lure into that environment, the fish might see something that kind of looks like a wounded bait fish, but chemically, it is dead space, complete silence. The tackle industry tries to fix this with overpriced bottles of synthetic attractants, but a 2018 study out of the University of Montana evaluated olfactory preferences in North American freshwater fish and found that natural compounds derived from animal tissue possess an attractant power up to 14 times greater than synthetic alternatives. Not 14%, 14 times. That is the gap between what the industry sells you and what biology actually demands. But here is where it gets interesting. Because even among natural baits, most anglers are using the wrong one. 2. The Bovine Supremacy. Why chicken liver is a trap. Walk along any riverbank in America, and you will see the same thing. Anglers using chicken liver for catfish. Every bait shop pushes it. Every beginner guide recommends it. And that is exactly the problem. It is what the industry wants you to grab off the shelf and never question. In the world of serious southern tournament fishing, chicken liver is considered amateur hour. The real weapon, the one that professionals quietly swear by and rarely discuss openly, is raw, unadulterated beef liver straight from the butcher counter. Why does the animal matter? Think of it this way. Beef liver is a denser, heavier fuel. It packs roughly 29 grams of protein per 100-gram serving compared to about 24 in chicken liver. That might not sound like much on paper, but in the water, The difference is devastating. That extra density means a more concentrated release of free amino acids, the exact chemical triggers that hijack a fish's brain and force an involuntary feeding response. The most critical of those amino acids is one called L-lysine. Researchers have tested it against dozens of other scent compounds, and L-lysine consistently triggers the most aggressive bite reaction ever documented in freshwater species. Beef liver is loaded with it. On top of that, beef liver carries significantly more iron and hemoglobin than its poultry counterpart. In practical terms, that means it bleeds harder and longer. In murky water or a moving current, that heavy metallic scent corridor punches through like a signal flare, while chicken liver is still whispering. You are not just putting meat on a hook. You are deploying a biological superstimulant that evolution hardwired fish to hunt down. But knowing what to use is only half of it. The real secret, the technique that won that tournament, is in how you apply it. And this is the part nobody talks about. 3. The championship rubbing technique, creating the chemical highway. Most anglers stab a chunk of liver onto a hook, cast it out, and sit in a lawn chair waiting for something to swim by. That is like lighting a candle in a hurricane and hoping someone sees it from a mile away. The professional Southern method does something radically different. It transforms your entire rig into a localized epicenter of chemical signaling. Here is how it works. Seconds before you cast, and timing matters here, take a small, dice-sized cube of raw, unseasoned beef liver and squeeze it firmly between your thumb and index finger. You are not trying to crush it apart. You are pressing it just hard enough to force out the dark, nutrient-dense liquid inside, the lifeblood of the organ. Now, with that potent fluid coating your hands, rub it aggressively onto the bare metal of the hook and then run your hands over the last 12 to 24 inches of your fishing line. This must happen within 20 seconds before the cast. The volatile compounds in that liquid begin breaking down the moment they hit air, so speed is everything. The reason you coat the line, and not just the hook, is critical. The animal fats and oils in beef liver are hydrophobic. They physically bond to the fishing line surface. A water-soluble dip bait washes out in seconds. These lipids cling and release slowly. Now picture what happens when this treated rig hits the water. The amino acids, particularly glycine and alanine, dissolve immediately and form an expanding scent plume. Think of dropping a single bead of dye into a slow-moving stream. It does not stay in one spot. It fans out, wider and wider, spreading downstream. Instead of one tiny point of smell sitting on your hook, you have just created a massive chemical highway, a scent corridor that can stretch 40 feet or more through the water column. Any fish that crosses that expanding field does not stumble onto your bait by accident. It locks on. To its brain, that trail is a neon sign pointing straight to a high-value meal, and it cannot ignore it. There is just one brutal problem. Beef liver, for all its power, has a weakness that can destroy everything you have just set up. 4. Armor plating the bait, the mechanics of fixation. Beef liver is firmer and grainier than the soft mush of chicken liver, but it is still an organ, packed with blood vessels and delicate membranes. Hit it with the whipping force of a long-distance cast or the rip of a fast current, and it tears right off the hook. Now you are sitting there fishing with bare steel, and you do not even know it. The tackle industry sells pre-rigged bait holders for $15 to solve this. Here is how Southern tournament anglers solve it for pennies. Level 1 is free. It is the sewing technique. Instead of jabbing the hook through once and hoping for the best, you find the thickest, densest section of the liver. Pass the hook through, roll the liver back onto itself, Then pierce a different section. Repeat until you have woven a multi-layered plug of tissue around the steel. Simple test. If it survives an aggressive handshake on the bank, it will survive the cast. Level 2 costs a couple of dollars. It uses what tournament anglers call magic thread, a specialized, ultra-elastic, knotless binding thread. Position the liver in the curve of the hook, then wrap the thread tightly around the meat 8 to 9 times. The elasticity causes it to physically cut into the surface of the liver, clamping it to the steel with a vice-like grip. No knots, no fumbling. Takes about 5 seconds. Level 3 is the nuclear option, the scent bomb. This is what professionals use when there is a $10,000 check on the line and the water is running hard through heavy cover. Take a golf ball-sized chunk of premium beef liver and place it in a 5 by 5 inch square of fine mesh. Atlas Mike's spawn netting works, or even cheap tulle fabric from a craft store for a fraction of the price. Pull the corners tight, twist, and lash it down with magic thread. Trim the excess. What you have now is an indestructible biological payload. The mesh does not block anything. The liver slowly weeps its blood and amino acids through the fabric, extending the effective fishing life of your bait for hours while making it completely immune to tearing. It is a slow-release chemical weapon wrapped in armor. But even with your bait locked down tight and your chemical highway laid out perfectly, there is one catastrophic mistake that will shut the entire system down. And it has nothing to do with your gear. It is something far more terrifying. And it is already happening every single time you touch your equipment. 5. The freezing hack and thermal management. Everything I just told you about beef liver, it is completely worthless if you make one mistake, and almost everyone makes it. Temperature. The biochemical potency of beef liver is extraordinarily sensitive to heat. The moment the tissue warms up, enzymes inside begin a process called autolysis. The liver literally starts digesting itself. The cellular membranes rupture, the bait turns to soft mush, and all those valuable amino acids wash out in seconds. You go from holding a biological superweapon to holding garbage. Professionals enforce a strict cold chain. The liver stays on ice in sealed containers. Sealed because melting water must never dilute the blood. That blood is the payload. You protect it like cash. But the true insider hack, the one quietly used by veterans in Tennessee and the Pacific Northwest, goes further. They create what they call frozen lipid cubes. Here is the process. Take pure sardine oil, mix it with half a teaspoon of dehydrated garlic powder, and freeze it into solid cubes in a standard ice tray. Why freeze it? Control. If you pour liquid oil into the water, it disperses violently and vanishes in seconds. But when you rub a frozen cube of concentrated fish fat against a metal hook, a thin, uniform layer bonds to the steel. When that layer hits water in the 72 to 82 degree range, standard summer lake temperatures across the U.S., it melts in ultra-thin microscopic layers. This controlled release mechanism continuously pumps omega-3 fatty acids into the water column for 15 to 25 minutes straight. The garlic is not decorative. The sulfur compounds in garlic, particularly diallyl disulfide, act as amplifiers that spread the scent trail faster and wider. It is the difference between a match that flares and dies in 1 second and a road flare that burns with steady, blinding intensity for half an hour. For optimal results, reapply the frozen cube to the hook every 20 minutes. If the water temperature exceeds 86 degrees, cut that interval to 10 minutes. The chemical beacon must never go dark. Now, this next part might be the most important thing you hear today. Because even if your bait is perfect, your temperature is perfect, and your technique is flawless, there is one invisible force that can override all of it. And it is sitting on your fingertips right now. 6. L-serine, the death scent on your fingertips. Have you ever fished right next to someone using the exact same bait, the exact same rig, in the exact same water, and they catch fish after fish while your line stays completely dead? The tackle industry has one answer for that: buy a different lure. The real answer is far more disturbing. You are not failing to attract fish. You are actively repelling them with your own hands. Back in the 1950s, biologists J.R. Brett and D. McKinnon ran a landmark study on salmon migration. They systematically dropped 54 different substances into a fish ladder: harsh pine oils, brass polishes, chemical solvents, to see what would deter salmon from their upstream run. The fish ignored almost everything, swam right through it. But there was one category of scent that caused them to completely panic. They aborted their migration. They literally jumped backward down the ladder in terror. That scent was mammalian skin. Water rinsed over bear paws, seal skin, and human hands. The scientists isolated the specific molecule responsible. It is an amino acid called L-serine. It is heavily concentrated in human sweat and the natural oils of your skin. It is present in every single fingerprint you leave behind. To a fish, L-serine is an evolutionary alarm bell. It signals the immediate presence of a predator, not food, death. Now think about what happens when you handle your hook, your line, your liver with bare, unwashed hands. You are painting every surface with a chemical that screams danger. If you have also applied sunscreen, bug spray with DEET, or smoked a cigarette, that repellent effect is supercharged. You have just taken a prime meal and camouflaged it with the scent of a killer. This is why chemical hygiene separates the masters from the amateurs. Before touching any bait or tackle, scrub your hands vigorously in plain river or lake water. Never use scented soap or antibacterial gel. The artificial fragrances are massive deterrents in their own right. The most elite tournament anglers refuse to touch the bait with bare skin at all. They use a dedicated strip of cloth to hold the liver while rubbing it onto the hook, guaranteeing the olfactory signal stays pristine and uncontaminated. Once you neutralize the death scent, everything changes. But there is one more weapon in this arsenal. A seasonal combination so effective that the old-timers who use it refuse to share it on camera. 7. Seasonal hacks and the devil's combination. Fish do not eat the same way all year. Their metabolic demands shift dramatically with the seasons, and if you are not adjusting, you are leaving monsters on the table. In the blistering heat of summer, the metabolic rates of catfish and carp skyrocket. They are burning fuel fast, actively hunting for dense protein to power rapid growth and muscle repair. Their noses are tuned to seek out the heaviest amino acid signals in the water. In winter, everything flips. Metabolisms crash. Fish shift into survival mode, their chemistry favoring compounds linked to immune function rather than muscle building. The extraordinary advantage of raw beef liver is that it naturally carries massive, balanced quantities of both summer and winter compounds. It is not a seasonal bait, it is a year-round universal weapon that adjusts to whatever the fish are craving. But here is the final piece, the one I almost did not include. In the backwoods of rural Arkansas, there is a mixture that the most secretive old-timers quietly refer to as the devil's combination. They guard it like a family heirloom, and after you hear it, you will understand why. If your target is massive carp or channel catfish, take the dark, extracted juice of raw beef liver and aggressively mix it with a small amount of raw, unprocessed honey. That is it. Heavy animal proteins fused with high-energy natural sugars. This creates an intensely complex scent profile that overwhelms the olfactory receptors of omnivorous fish. It does not just attract them, it triggers a feeding frenzy so violent it looks like the fish are materializing out of thin air. The tackle industry will never put this on a shelf. It cannot be branded, bottled, or marked up 300%. And that is exactly why you have never heard of it. Until right now. The forbidden knowledge that the multi-million-dollar tackle industry has been sitting on is now in your hands. $3 at the butcher counter. Strict chemical hygiene to kill the death scent. Magic thread to lock the rig down. The rubbing technique to paint an invisible chemical highway straight to your hook. And if you want to go nuclear, frozen lipid cubes and the devil's combination. The next time you are on the water, 90% of the anglers around you will be casting $65 synthetic rigs into the void, praying for luck, fighting against the L-serine on their own fingers without even knowing it. And they will watch you pull in fish after fish, wondering what expensive secret lure you are using, completely oblivious that the ultimate weapon fits in a shirt pocket and costs less than a cup of coffee. Knead the liver. Rub the hook. Watch the water erupt. If you want more techniques the industry does not want you to know, you know exactly where to find them. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures, because the secrets being brought to the surface are just getting started.